Hey everybody, this week's Torah portion is Parshas Vayeshev, and in this week's Torah portion, Joseph, one of the 12 tribes, is sold by his brothers, and he ends up making his way down to Egypt. Now the Torah tells us that when his brothers sold him, they didn't just give him away, they actually sold him, so they got money in return, and the Medrash wants to know, what did they do with that money? So the Medrash says what they did was they bought themselves a pair of shoes. Each one got one pair of shoes. Now, why in the world would the Torah and the Medrash need to tell us that they decided to use the money to buy a pair of shoes? Why, in fact, did they use the money to buy a pair of shoes? Why didn't they just take that money and give it to charity or do something else with it? Why specifically did they want to buy a pair of shoes when they decided to sell Yosef? Why was the money used for shoes? So our rabbis tell us a very interesting idea. And that is that the brothers understood that this wasn't just a one-time sale with no long-term consequences. This was the beginning of the exile. This was stage one of the Jewish people ultimately leaving the land of Israel and settling in a different land. And because of that, they had to get the message across to themselves of what their mission would be in that land. Now, what do shoes do? Shoes are what separate us from the ground that we're on. What the Jewish people were scared of, what the brothers were scared of, was that when they would leave Israel, and they would leave their homeland, they would go to another place and forget about their home country, and forget that that's where they belong, and they would start to become like the Egyptians, and start to feel like this was their land. So immediately at the beginning of the exile, the first thing they did was to buy a pair of shoes which are used to separate between the person and the land, as a way of saying to themselves that we have to make sure that when we're down there, when we're away from our country, we do not end up turning into people who think that this is our land. Our land is Israel. And we're going to have a barrier between us and the ground to remind us that this is not the ground that we want to stand on. And that's what they held on to their entire time in the state of Egypt. They remembered that this is not our home, this is not our country, and this is not our home. And that's really the lesson that we've been continuing on since then, to always remember that really Israel is where we belong, and Israel is our country. And until we're back there as an entire nation, we're going to use the shoes to symbolize to ourselves that there's a separation between us and the land that we stand on. On behalf of Makar, Shabbat Shalom.